Imagine you've been locked out of the world's most powerful financial system, not metaphorically, literally. The bank account's frozen, the international payment rails cut, the currency your entire oil economy was built on suddenly weaponized against you. That is Iran's reality. And for decades, the conventional wisdom was simple: sanctions work because they hurt. Economic pain creates political change. The dollar is the lever, and Washington holds it. But here's what nobody is asking: what happens to a nation's financial psychology after years of being forcibly ejected from the dollar system? Because Iran didn't collapse. Iran didn't capitulate. Instead, Iran did something far more interesting and far more consequential for the future of global finance. It began selling oil in Chinese Yuan. On the surface, that looks like a pragmatic workaround, a sanction-busting trade route, inconvenient for Washington, perhaps, but manageable. Except the numbers are no longer small. Iran and China's bilateral trade has grown into the tens of billions annually. Shanghai Cooperation Organization is expanding. The BRICS bloc is actively discussing non-dollar settlement systems. And Saudi Arabia, the very kingdom that anchored the petrodollar, has held conversations about pricing some oil sales in yuan. What started as Iran's desperate survival move is quietly becoming a geopolitical. Mainstream analysts see a currency substitution story. But there is something far deeper happening here, something that conventional economics frameworks are almost structurally incapable of seeing. To understand what's really going on, you need a different kind of economist entirely. Richard H. Thaler won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2017 for one foundational insight: human beings and the institutions they build, and they do not behave like the rational actors that classical economics assumes. They are loss-averse, status quo dependent, and deeply irrational in predictable patterned ways. When you apply Thaler's behavioral economics framework to Iran's yuan pivot, the story stops being about currency, it becomes about psychology. And psychology, as Thaler's work demonstrates, is far harder to reverse than policy. Let's begin with the framework that explains everything about why Iran moved and why it cannot easily move back. Thaler's theory of loss aversion, developed alongside Daniel Kahneman and drawing from decades of research compiled in Misbehaving and Nudge, establishes that losses feel roughly twice as powerful psychologically as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. Applied to sovereign economic behavior, this means a nation facing the loss of dollar access will respond with far greater urgency and irrationality than a nation being offered a better currency alternative. Iran was not nudged toward the yuan by attractive incentives. Iran was pushed by the unbearable psychological weight of dollar exclusion. That distinction matters enormously because behavior driven by loss aversion tends to be more durable, more emotionally entrenched, and critically more resistant to reversal than behavior driven by rational gain seeking. Now layer on Thaler's concept of the endowment effect. In his landmark research, Thaler demonstrated that people assign greater value to things simply because they own or are accustomed to them. For decades, dollar-denominated oil trade was Iran's economic default, the system it owned, understood, and operated within. Losing it triggered not just economic disruption, but a profound psychological dislocation. What replaced it, the Yuan system, is now itself subject to the endowment effect. Iran has built infrastructure, relationships, and institutional habits around Yuan trade. That system is now theirs, and the endowment effect predicts they will overvalue it relative to any outside assessment. Then comes status quo bias, one of Thaler's most powerful and underappreciated concepts. In Nudge, co-authored with Cass Sunstein, Thaler argues that people and institutions have a deep default preference for the current state of affairs, regardless of whether it is optimal. For Iran, the UN trade route is now the status quo. Reversing it, even if geopolitical conditions improve dramatically, would require overcoming enormous institutional inertia, political sunk costs, and the psychological comfort of the familiar. Status quo bias, Thaler's research shows, is not a temporary preference, it calcifies. And here is where mental accounting enters, perhaps Thaler's most elegant framework. Thaler's mental accounting theory, detailed extensively in his academic work. Thaler's mental accounting theory, detailed extensively in his academic work, describes how individuals and institutions create separate psychological accounts for different streams of money, treating them as fundamentally distinct even when they are economically equivalent. I knew it could happen. Iran has mentally separated its yuan oil revenues into a completely different psychological ledger from its dollar-era finances. These are not interchangeable in Iran's institutional mind. The yuan account carries the weight of survival, sovereignty, and resistance, emotional tags that no exchange rate calculation can neutralize. Together, these four frameworks, loss aversion, the endowment effect, status quo bias, and mental accounting, paint a picture that no conventional currency analyst is drawing. Iran's yuan adoption is not a rational hedge, it is a psychologically locked-in response, reinforced at every layer by the very cognitive architecture that Thaler spent his career mapping. Here is what mainstream financial media consistently misses about this story. Commentators frame Iran's yuan trade as a workaround, temporary, limited, born of necessity. The implicit assumption is that once sanctions are lifted or once geopolitical tensions ease, the dollar will return as the natural default. That assumption is not just wrong. According to Thaler's framework, it is precisely backwards. Consider the mechanism of nudge theory, but applied in reverse. Thaler's nudge framework, developed for nudge and applied across policy from pension enrollment to organ donation, demonstrates that the default option is extraordinarily powerful. It is not chosen consciously. It is simply the path of least resistance. Washington built the dollar system as the global financial default for decades. But sanctions against Iran, Russia, and others have forcibly changed the default for those nations. And once a new default is established and reinforced through years of institutional habit, the old default does not automatically reassert itself. It has to be actively rechosen against the grain of every bias Thaler has documented. The unseen consequence is that the behavioral infrastructure of de-dollarization is being built quietly below the threshold of mainstream attention. Every yuan-settled oil transaction Iran completes makes the next one easier, cheaper, and more psychologically normal. This is what Thaler's research into habit formation and choice architecture reveals. Systems that are used consistently become self-reinforcing, regardless of whether they are optimal. There is a second hidden consequence that Thaler's work on social preferences and herding behavior illuminates. When other nations observe Iran surviving, not just surviving, but functioning outside the dollar system, it recalibrates their risk perception. The availability of a visible working precedent is enormously powerful in behavioral economics. Iran is not just trading in yuan. Iran is demonstrating in real time that the psychological barrier to dollar exit is lower than previously imagined. The mainstream narrative calls this a fringe arrangement. Thaler's behavioral models suggest it is a demonstration effect, and demonstration effects, once widely observed, have a habit of becoming movements. So if Thaler's models hold, what should we watch for? First, watch for sludge, Thaler's term for the friction and bureaucratic complexity that makes desirable actions harder. The United States has, consciously or not, reduced its own sludge problem by repeatedly using the dollar as a sanctions weapon. Washington has incentivized adversarial nations to invest in reducing the sludge of alternative payment systems. The easier yuan settlement becomes operationally, the more powerful Thaler's status quo bias works in its favor. Second, watch the neutral nations, the fence sitters. Thaler's research on present bias tells us that actors defer difficult decisions until the cost of inaction becomes acute. Countries like India, Turkey, and the Gulf states are currently in that present bias holding pattern, but demonstration effects accumulate. When enough peers normalize yuan trade, the present bias calculation shifts, and fence-sitters move quickly. Third, and most critically, watch for irreversibility signals. Thaler's framework predicts that once institutional systems pass a certain threshold of entrenchment, the cost of reversal exceeds that irrational threshold. A 9 may already cross that line. Others are approaching it. The dollar is not dying. But its psychological monopoly, the assumption that it is the only conceivable default, is quietly being dismantled, one behaviorally reinforced transaction at a time. Here is the insight that reframes everything. This was never really a story about currency, and it was always a story about defaults, loss, and the extraordinary human resistance to reversing a decision once it has been made and emotionally absorbed. Iran didn't just dump the dollar. A mine demonstrated that the psychological lock-in of any financial system, no matter how dominant, can be broken by sustained enough pain. So here's the question for you. Which nation do you think is next to quietly cross that threshold, and why? If this analysis made you think differently about global finance, like this video, subscribe to Flashpoint and hit the notification bell. The next breakdown is already in progress.